Hi and welcome back to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a wonderful day today. For the free wire tutorial here on YouTube, I'd like to share with you my fancy looped earrings. Now you can add ready-made charms, or I'll show you a couple of different ways of just creating your own dangling charms with beads. And we'll add that onto the basic hooped frame we're going to make together. Let's head down to the board and take a closer look, and then we'll chat about materials. So this is the project we're going to work on together today, and I'm going to be using 2 gauges of wire, 1mm or 18 gauge for the looped section and the hoop itself, and then we're going to apply some 0.4mm 26 gauge to band the 2 main elements together. Now you can very simply add scraps of charms, or you can add ready-made charms. Anything along those lines, little bits of chain, or you can create very simple droppers if you prefer. I will show you how to just do this little looped charm at the end of the video, but the main thing we're going to look at today is creating the body of the earring. So I have one up at the side ready to run with. We're going to start by using about 6 inches of 1mm or 18 gauge wire. This is a medium temper wire. You can use really any that you have available. Firm wire is perfectly acceptable for this design. Softer wire, probably slightly less so. This is a medium temper I'm working with today. So I've just smoothed that through a handful of times, and I'm going to ensure that the one end we're going to start working on is nice and flush cut. Put that little scrap away so it can't give you any aggravations. So we're going to use then our round nose pliers just to turn over a little loop on the end, and that's where we're going to start from. Now I like to keep the end loop or the start point nice and flat, so I'm just going to give that a bit of a squish to make sure that I can keep that nicely strong. And I'm just adding a little gentle curve to give you an idea of how this is going to come together. So our first loop has the cut end sitting against the continuation of the wire, just to make it less likely to catch on anything. We're then going to continue along to create 5 separate loops, and I do this on the outside curve of the wire that we're creating. And if you're making these as earrings, which I am today, what I tend to do is to make this section of looped wire, and all I've done is chase that wire around the round edge of my round pliers, and we're going to create equally distanced, equally sized loops as we go along. When you make them as earrings, which is what they're designed as today, you'll want to make a little strip like we're going to do now, and then match that with a second strip. It's much easier to ensure that the loops are the same size, they sit in the same orientation, and that they are all equally spaced before you add them to the frame. So to keep a nice flat baseline, I'm just going to very gently pinch the bottom of that circular form, add a little bit more warmth, and then grab those round nose pliers back again. So there are 2 ways you can do it. You can move the wire around the pliers, or you can take the wire and instead of moving the pliers, you can move the wire. Whichever makes your hands happy. You can do a combination of both. What we're looking to do is to keep the gaps between those loops the same, and we're looking to keep the wire moving in the same fashion. So what you'll notice is that the wire skirts over the top. When it comes round, it goes underneath, over the top and then underneath, and it looks like a continuously machined, almost like a bezel strip if you like. I have used this design, this loopy design, as bezel strips, as housings to go around pendants, all sorts over the years. It's a really lovely, very easily accessible technique to get your hands on. So adding a little bit more warmth into the next stretch of wire, going to turn that wire around, draw the tail underneath. Now I'm going to make the 2 loops now too close together to show you how to fix that problem. If you create 2 loops that are too close together, what you can do is just move that along gently. So I'll put those pliers back into the loop and just rotate them around gently, very gently, until you pull the loop far enough away from the preceding loop so that it sits the right distance. So we're looking to have those the same distance apart. Still got a little way to go, so I'm going to pop those pliers back in and rotate that away, pushing up underneath the baseline of the wire to ensure that you get that distance the same. Now what can happen is you end up with a deviation in that baseline of wire, so we can fix that by popping the tip of those bent chain nose pliers in, or any fine tipped straight flat facing pliers, and just play with that until it sits exactly how you want it to. Now I'm generating a little bit of a curve just here because I will use that in the design. The loops need to be on the outside of the curve rather than on the inside. So I'm going to finish off this design, or this section of the design now, with a final loop. So if I rotate the wire around, and I tell you what, this time I'll make it too far away. So you can see that the start of my loop is very, very definitely too far away. This is really easy to fix. We're going to pop those round nose pliers back in and rotate around until the loop sits the right distance from the preceding loop. So as we did with the first loop, we're going to cut the wire away at the base here. You can see we've got a couple of inches left, and we'll use that to generate one of these little drops later on. Nothing is ever wasted. What we're going to do is to use the flush side of our cutters to trim that section. Let's pop that scrap over to one side before we bring that loop into position as the last loop on this little segment. So I'm going to give that a quick squish to make sure that it's nice and smooth. You can just rotate that around if you need to. Now I'm not going to try terribly hard to flatten these loops down, but I do want them to sit in the same orientation. If you find that you need a little bit more of a smooth arc shape, you can very, very gently modify this with your straight facing pliers. In this case, my bent chain nose pliers. The two faces that come together are flat. So let's just grab a hold of that until we've got that nice curving arch that we're looking for, or an arc. Now you may like to use a mandrel to help you get this correct, but you don't have to have professional tools for this design. It's very, very easy and accessible. I made this one using the top of a perfume bottle. So the beads I used in today's demonstration earring I made from the Magical Mystery bead box from Jesse James Beads for May 2023. Now I like to think of them as Swedish colours as much as they are part of the Frida Kahlo frame is the name of the painting that this was inspired by, this little box, which is where all of these beads came from. Well, I hope that you like the choices that I've made here, but we're going to continue to make the hoop section, and then I'll show you how to bring everything together. In this next section, we're going to use 12 inches of 1mm or 18 gauge wire. Again, I'm using a medium temper. Terribly soft wire is probably not advisable, but you can use a very firm wire for this. Now, if you're making earrings, I do tend to do them bit by bit. So I'll make two sections, get them matched up as closely as possible between each movement forward through the tutorial. So I'm starting with my 12 inches of that 1mm wire, and I'm going to use my mandrel to create a round form. Again, this one I used with a perfume lid, so you don't need special materials. I'm just going to find the approximate centre of that length of wire and wrap it around the point on my mandrel, which works for me. Now, if you're making earrings and you want them to be the same time and time again, you might want to make a measurement or actually make a mark on your mandrel, or use the same perfume pot each time. So we've got that round form. Now, it's very, very easy techniques that we're going to be using now. We're just going to do some simple coiling, some simple wrapping, and a wrapped loop up at the top. What I would say is it's much easier to achieve a really lovely, neat design with repeatable sizes if you leave that hoop shape on your mandrel whilst you're doing this. So I'm going to turn up one of those ends, and again I started in approximately the centre, so what you'll end up with is a sort of a clock face with a 12 o'clock spar coming off at the top and one going off at 90 degrees. And what we're going to do is decide exactly what size we want this to be, and we're going to mark that on our mandrel, and then we're going to take the sideways tail and wrap that around that upright, or that 12 o'clock. Now, if you pre-warm your wire, it will be a delight and it will easily smooth its way around. What may occur is that this is a little bit too loose for you, so we can take that off and we can just tighten up the wrapping. But what will happen is when you start to pull this tail of wire away, it will start to steal wire from this side of the hoop form that you're making, hence keeping it on the mandrel will ensure that you don't lose too much of that size or shape in your creativity. So let's just bring that across. So I've got 3 wraps around that upright. Now when you're making these as earrings, as we're going to do for today's design, what I tend to do is get this point all the way through in both pieces, both parts, and then I will trim accordingly on both sides. And that means that I will end up with exactly the same size coil if you're adding a coil, and ensure that you have exactly the same amount of wire up at the top to create that really super neat wrapped loop. Now the next thing that one would need to do is just tighten up this coil. Now I'm very, very careful at this stage because pinching your fingers with the tips of sharp pliers is never a good idea. So just take your time and make sure that you're moving in a way that you know you can control. So we've just tightened up that little wrap really, really neatly. We can pop that back on and just give that a little bit of a roundening. As I mentioned to you a moment ago, what I would do when making these as earrings is ensure that I'm trimming the same distance on here, on this side, on both parts of the frame before I move on. I'm not going to do that right now because I'm not going to be making another earring today, just this for the tutorial. So you trim both pieces to the same length, and in that way you can ensure your coils will be the same size. Then up at the top we're going to go for a wrapped loop. So I'm just going to pull that wire away. What you can do if you want to ensure absolute mirror imaging is wrap these opposite to one another. So if I wrap the left earring so that the wire pops over to the right over the top, I will try to do the other one in the opposite direction. In that way you will end up with exact mirror images. Now if you don't do this, it really doesn't matter, because by the time you've turned this little section of wire into a coil and popped it down over the front of the neck of the earring, it's really kind of hard to see if you didn't do that. So don't fret if that isn't something that happens when you're creating your earrings. So we're going to go for a wrapped loop up at the top. So just pop those round nose pliers in, draw the wire all the way around, and you will need to make sure that your loop up at the top is the same on both pairs of earrings, both halves of your earrings, sorry. So just ensure that you're using the same sort of size loop and it sits in the same fashion. And what I'm going to do here is just draw that tail all the way around and wrap the remainder of that neck section of the design, and then just cut away at the back. So I think I can get one more pass of the wire around. Doesn't look terribly neat at the moment. Just going to give that a teeny tiny squish, and a little bit of a squeeze over the top. Now if you wanted to, you could trim this second wire at the back to the same length, and then you can have a coil on the back as well, but I'm keeping it a little bit simpler today. Normally I make things quite fancy, and what we're just going to do is squish that tail of wire down so that it doesn't get into your hair or clothes, scarves or anything like that. Let's give that a bit of a squish and a squeeze to make sure it's super tidy. And then over the surface, once we've straightened up that loop, giving that a bit of strength as well while we go through, we're going to pop back in now with those round nose pliers to create a coil, which I know is used and repeated an awful lot, so I won't go over and over it. Let's just tighten that up slightly. But it's a very, very useful technique to learn. So I'm going to draw that all the way down until you can just push that down over the face of the design. Straighten up that little neckline. You can obviously take a little bit more time, and do try to get those to be the same kind of size, the same kind of dimensions. If you want to think about it, then you can have those coils going in opposite directions. Just whoops-a-daisy, just get that to sit down nice and flat. Very, very gentle squish and a squeeze, and it's quite happy. If you find that your hoop shape has slightly come out of form, pop it back on the mandrel and just draw it up towards the fatter end very, very gently, and you'll be able to get that to be around once more. If you have a nylon head hammer or something similar, you can give that a little bit of a beating, and then it will be just a little bit firmer. But as I said earlier, using a very soft wire is not advisable in this. You want a medium or a firmer gauge wire. So what we're going to do in the next stage is bind these two sections together. Super easy. You can refer back to the same point on your mandrel to just get the idea of those strips matching up before you make a start. But as you start binding them together, they will naturally form into a lovely, neat finish. With this design, what I like to do is have lots of these segments prepared, and then I can customise them really very quickly with beads or danglies or chains or whatever you fancy adding on later. So I will get lots of these ready and sat in a box, all handmade, handcrafted, just ready to be customised. It means you can have a slightly faster turnaround when you get those custom orders. So when you've got your 2 hoop sections and your 2 looped sections all ready to go and they all match, we can begin to just combine these together. Very, very simple techniques in today's video, super accessible for all. What we're looking to do with our 5 loops is to get the middle of those 5 equal and opposite at the 6 o'clock position, opposite that wrapped loop up at the 12 o'clock position. So I like to use around about 12 to 14 inches of that 0.4mm or 26 gauge wire, and I will be banding the areas between each of those loops. Now I've just noticed that that's ever so slightly open on the end, so just to make sure that that is super neat and tidy, I'm going to give that a very gentle squish and just close it up. So let's get that sighted down at that 6 o'clock position, nice and neat and tidy. You can of course make these much larger with as many of these loops as you desire. So I'm going to start around about halfway along that 12 to 14 inches of finer wire, and I'm just going to push approximately half of that all the way through, down through the centre of the loop and underneath both of those pieces, So all I'm doing here is I'm going to band together the looped section to the hoop section, and I'm going to do that as firmly as I possibly can. So as many rotations as I can fit between each of those loops, and I'm not going to do this as many times as you need because it gets very boring. But what you can see is I'm pulling the remainder of the wire over on the right hand side through, and every time I'm doing that, I'm making sure that those bands sit nice and neat and firmly against one another. Let's just give that the last squish. I think I can get one more in. Give that a wiggle. Did you hear that little click? That's the wire fitting up between that last little section of the loop. So I've absolutely filled the one section between my middle loop and the next adjacent one on the right. So I'm going to bring the wire sideways across the back at a diagonal and bring it around the outside of the next gap between those loops. Now what you can see here is that the wire isn't quite perfectly formed, so I'm just going to give that a little manual help to make it sit super neat, and we're going to do the same thing again. So I'm just going to do this on the one side. Every time I create a band around that connection between the hoop section and the loops, I'm going to ensure it's both firmly pulling, so there's lots of tension in this design, as you can tell by my camera wobbling, and then we're going to fill that gap as much as we possibly can. When you have got to the very last bit, we're going to do, let's see, no, I don't think I can get another one. I'm going to draw the wire again diagonally across the back, so before the loop it's just gone over the top, across the back diagonally, and then I'm going to finish up the design by wrapping probably 6 or 7 times around just the hoop section, and this will ensure that there's good attachment between the two pieces. So that's 5, and we'll go for one more 6 times. So normally I would try to cut the wire so that it sits inside the hoop, so it causes as little potential for damage as possible. So I'm just going to trim that wire away with the flush side of my cutters, which make very good tweezers, and then I'm going to take my flat facing pliers and just rotate it around in the direction that the wire is circling to smooth that end section down. And in doing this, you're also adding a kind of a memory to that coil to make sure that it knows you want it to stay firmly coiled around the hoop. So if I just show you the underside, you can see those little sideways or diagonal stripes I've used a contrasting colour. Flip that back to the front, and what I would do now is ensure that I don't have any diagonals on the front, so I will either bring that wire around, yep, there's one space for one more there, and ensure that the pass of wire that's diagonal goes on the back of the design. Push the wire up through the centre, and then I can continue banding between each of these loop sections. When I get to the far side, I will add 6 wraps around just the hoop, and then cut and finish in exactly the same way. So I finished wrapping the hoop section to the looped section, all very neatly banded. Just remains to add on your earring finding and whatever you fancy dangling down from those hoops. So I'm going to use a handful of beads left over from the frame bead mix from the Magical Mystery Bead Box Viva Frida, which was May 2023, courtesy of Jesse James. Lovely collection of colours in there. One of the simplest things that you can do to add a little bit of drama, but not too much of a drop, is to use a single bead and create a double simple loop connector. So I'm going to come just about 6 or so millimetres from one end of a little piece of scrap wire, and I'm going to create a simple loop, just using those round nose pliers to twist that around on itself until it meets back at that angle we created. And you can make that a little bit more neatly than I have. I'm just trying to show you how quick it is. We're going to add on one of these gorgeous faceted blue beads with a lovely coating. And I'm going to make these at 90 degrees. These little loops, very, very simple loops at 90 degrees to one another. And in a moment I'll show you how to add that on to that lovely looped earring that we made together. So let's just create that second loop. Trim away any excess and pop it into the scrap pot so that it doesn't get caught underfoot. Now the reason I do this one in 2 different orientations at 90 degrees to one another is because it shows when you hang it on the loop, you've got this little loop right down at the bottom as well. I've said the word loop 90,000 times now. Let's move on to the next small section. So when I'm adding a dangle onto the base, I need to make sure that both ends are cut nice and smooth. Again, we're coming about 6 millimetres to 8 millimetres from one end of that section of scrap wire. It's 1 millimetre wire, 18 gauge wire as we used, and it's just offcuts from when we were creating the loop and the hoop. So let's close up that looped section, and I'm just going to give that a little bit of a squish to add some strength into it. Open it up, pop in my charm or dropper down at the base, close that back up, lovely little bit of pink enamel on this one, and then we're going to add a couple of bead caps and a single bead. Slide that down onto the wire, add your bead, top with a bead cap. You don't have to have bead caps, I just think that they look really nice with this semi-matte coloured pink, sort of faux pearl almost. Now for this one I'm going to orient the 2 loops in the same orientation. So drawing the wire towards me, and then again with those round nose pliers to create that small loop. You can very simply, instead of this technique, just add on little charms or chain scraps, whatever you've got available to add drama to your design. So let's trim away the end of that wire using the flush side of those cutters. Make that loop nice and strong. So I'm going to make sure that it's a good shape and that the cut end meets the angle. Give that a squish, and then that will be ready to go in just a moment. So I'm putting that to one side, and then we're going to have a slightly longer dangle in the centre. So again, making sure that those 2 ends are nice and flush cut, nice and smooth. Adding that angle in about 6 to 8 millimetres from the end of the wire. I'm just using the box joint of my round nose pliers because I am lazy. If you want a firmer angle on that wire, you can use your chain nose pliers. So let's give that a quick smooth through. I haven't made one of these already, so I'm just doing this on the fly, winging it. Let's add one of these lovely flowery, almost like a fairy skirt or something down at the base. And then we're going to add a bunch of beads. So let's put this crystal drop down at the lowest part of the wire. And then we're going to add in a bead cap, a bead and another bead cap. And then we'll finish off with another simple loop. Now in certain aspects of jewellery making, I prefer to go for wrapped loops. So when I'm creating the top of the earrings, or especially when I'm creating designs like pendants, I very definitely want wrapped loops up at the bail for security. But when I'm creating earrings, I don't intend to hang my handbag, not that I use a handbag, but I don't intend to hang anything weighty off these designs. So a simple loop is more than adequate most of the time. Sometimes you'll want to go for the security of a wrapped loop. So let's trim that one away, get the scrap out of the way, and then close up that last simple loop, give it a squish. Those are just some very, very simple ideas for using up scrap bits of wire and odd beads. So here's the earring finding that we made together today. This is the front of my design because it has the coil on it. So we're going to open up each of those simple loops and add them into position. I like the angle change at the front and the cut wire at the back of my designs. You really struggle to see the difference when it's in place. I think that that's quite a nice way to just ensure that you have the highest quality. Another thing you can do is make sure it goes through the right loop. I'm leaving that in because it's funny. There we go, let's close that loop up again, give it a squish. So there's your central loop, and then we made one each of those designs a second ago together. So give that loop a final squish, open it up, put the cut side towards the rear of the design and then close that up. And then the final one, we're going to sit these oriented differently. So again, if I open that up, slide that into position so that the cut goes to the rear of the design, close it up. When I pop that down on the board, you'll see that you can see the loops sideways, whereas the loops in the droppers that we've added are forwards, so they're less visible. It's just something that you can do to add a bit of a difference to those designs. So you could use lots and lots of random leftover beads and create a rosary linked chain if you wanted to. But that's just an idea on what you can do to add drama to your fancy looped earrings. Again, please forgive the slightly breathy delivery today. I'm really battling the asthma because of the pollen, but that's what we've created today using scrap beads, really, left over from another project that I worked on. I like the colour combination, but I really love the yellow and the blue, or the royal and the gold together. I hope you've enjoyed the fancy looped earring tutorial, and I look forward to seeing you back again very, very soon. Bye for now.